Good morning, everyone, and welcome. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Steven Silver. I'm the owner and third generation of American Pipe and Tank, our family business, which is now 4 generations strong. I've been working in this business for almost 30 years, and I've seen every type of tank in their best and in their worst condition. Before we get started, I'd like to thank you for taking time out of your busy or not so busy schedule to join me this morning. In addition to all of the doctors, nurses, and first responders, I would like to give a huge shout out to the countless property managers, building engineers, and to keep this great city of ours running throughout these most unusual times. Before we get started, and before we dive into this presentation, please sit back for a few minutes, watch a short video that the New York Times filmed with us. While it was filmed a few years ago, the content of this video couldn't be more relevant than at this moment in time.
Pisa has the leaning tower, and Paris has the Eiffel Tower, and New York has the water tower.
This is Frank Runyon for the New York Times. There are 10 to 20,000 water tanks on rooftops across New York City. They're the primary source of drinking water for many city dwellers. And yet, the tanks are breeding grounds for bacteria, and regulation of them is rarely enforced.
If part of my drinking water came from this, it would certainly change the way I drank water in the city of New York. It had nothing to do with the municipal water supply, it has to do with the tank.
The Times tested 14 tanks in 12 buildings in Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens. 8 of the tank samples were positive for coliform bacteria, and 5 had E. coli. The health department, which is responsible for ensuring that building owners inspect and test their tanks for bacteria, refused our on-camera interview requests, though an official told us that they are satisfied with the inspection requirements, as they are right now. But Dr. Stephen Edberg, a leading medical and public health microbiologist who invented CholAlert, one of the world's most widely used tests for bacteria, says there's cause for concern.
E. coli has only one source. It is only there because some animal is defecating in that place. It's the only way it gets there.
You have a bunch of 2x4s that get built out here as framework.
Right. Stephen Silver is a third-generation tank man with American Pipe and Tank.
When the roof on the tank is in deteriorated condition and it's open to the atmosphere, you have dust, dirt, pigeons, garbage. We've seen people living in roof tanks. You see mice and vermin in the roof tanks. And this is, for the most part, people's drinking water that the people in the building don't even know about.
New York City's water is gravity-fed from reservoirs upstate. But this aqueduct system can only deliver water up to 6 stories. So to provide water pressure to the upper floors, water is pumped from the basement to a rooftop tank before draining directly into taps. Water tanks can be exposed to the elements for up to 50 years. So to keep them in working order, they need to be maintained.
New York City require that these tanks are cleaned and disinfected a minimum of once a year, because this is a building's primary drinking water source. So to prevent algae and bacteria from flourishing, which it would under normal conditions, you have a tank of water that's baking out in the sunshine all summer long, you're going to get things growing in the tank.
We had the chance to drop our camera into a tank on a building above Times Square. We could see a layer of sediment that had built up at the bottom. This is a common sight in water tanks around the city. Sediment should be flushed out every year.
It's so inexpensive to maintain the code by cleaning your water tank and taking a water sample.
Cleaning.
Okay. I hope you enjoyed the video. Now let's discuss the impact the coronavirus outbreak has had on our city over the past couple of months. 3 main points we'll discuss today: concerns from tenants and residents, empty commercial buildings and hotels, and water usage in residential buildings that's off the charts. Let's start with tenant and resident concerns. As we all know, and as these studies show, these past couple of months have been extremely stressful for everyone. As we speak with many of our clients, as well as just family and friends, wants to know what managers and owners are doing to keep their buildings safe and clean. It may be easy to have residents feel safe in an apartment building. Staff clean the elevators and common areas more frequently. However, it's not as easy making people feel safe returning to their offices that they haven't been in for months. The closer we get towards reopening our city and going back into the office, the more people worry about what the new normal will look like. With all the stress, uncertainty, and doubt, it's our job to help ease some of these concerns and assure our city's residents that we're doing everything within our power to keep their homes and offices clean, safe, and healthy. Commercial buildings and hotels pretty much fall into the same categories these days. As we know, for the past 2 months, every office building and hotel in the city has remained completely closed or mostly vacant. This has caused the water in the tanks and the plumbing system to turn stagnant. I spoke to 2 clients last week with high-rise office buildings in Midtown Manhattan. One of them usually sees 7,000 people a day. They have 150 these days. Another one normally sees 5,000 a day. They had 70 people register. A lot of the people aren't even staying in their offices. They're coming in, they're checking their mail, they're leaving again. So again, these buildings are largely vacant. As we'll see in a moment with some photos, the potable water has now been sitting with little or no movement. This changes the chemical and physical composition of the building's water, as well as the water in the tank. The water gets cloudy, a lot of sediment sits in the tank, particles and dust float throughout the water, and this also includes a heavy layer of film on the surface. This is a definite sign of stagnant water when you get that film. More significantly, the chlorinated water that is constantly being put from the water main into these commercial buildings has all but stopped. Now that the chlorinated water has dissipated and the water in the tanks, plumbing systems, and cooling towers sit stagnant, the tank is at risk of algae and bacteria growing. The people working and returning to their offices are at risk of consuming water that may not be safe to drink. In addition, warming weather and the lack of clean, chlorinated flowing water through these building systems can lead to Legionnaires' disease. This is exactly what happened a couple of years ago with the Legionnaires' outbreak in the Bronx and Harlem. A lot of buildings were not properly maintained. They were completely neglected by management and ownership. A lot of people died, unfortunately. Even more unfortunate, a lot of people got sick. Even more unfortunate, several people died as well. As you can see from this brief graph over here, this chart, most Legionella bacteria is actually detected in potable water, not in cooling towers where most people think it comes from. But again, these systems, they sit stagnant. You have to do something about it. Residential buildings, a lot of them fall into the same category as the empty office buildings and hotels. While pretty much everyone knows that offices and hotels are sitting empty these days, many are forgetting that this is also happening across many of the high-end co-ops and condos in Manhattan. A lot of management company in Midtown and lives in Connecticut. We laughed because all of the properties that were on the market a month and a half ago, whether they were homes or apartments for rent, have all been taken up. There's also another building in Lincoln Center, uptown. Big apartment building is now 70%. On the flip side, many apartment buildings in the city are beyond full these days, which are using 2 to 3 times more water than they normally do. This has an opposite effect on the building's water supply, where the normal amount of rust and sediment that enters from the building into the building from the city water mains has doubled. This can have an adverse effect on different pieces of equipment in the building, such as pumps and backflow preventers, any type of equipment that has mechanical seals and O-rings and moving parts. All of this increased sediment coming into the building will also wear and tear these parts quicker than normal. Something to keep an eye on. Let's talk about what actions can be taken. Now that we've gone through how the coronavirus outbreak, is impacting our domestic water system, let's discuss what you can do to address these issues and to ensure that all of the tenants in your building have safe water. Let's take a quick poll. Before discussing these recommendations, I'd like to know, 2 glasses of water here. Would you drink from the glass on the right? We're going to sit back for a few seconds. We're going to collect some data from people entering. Let's see what we come up with. I think I have an idea what everyone's answer is going to be. Okay, as I suspected, everyone said no, they would not. And this is exactly what your building's water tank looks like after the water's been sitting stagnant for all these months. And the tank has not been filled with the city's chlorinated water, which will typically replenish the water in the tank multiple times during the course of the day. In order to help maintain a safe and healthy domestic water system, we recommend thoroughly flushing your building's water tank and entire domestic water system a minimum of once a week. Now, if you've not been doing this for the past couple of months and the water has been stagnant, we recommend you start off with a tank cleaning and a disinfection. After this, you should continue to flush the system at least once a week to ensure the chlorinated water is refilling the tank and running through the building's plumbing system. In addition to the cleaning, it's essential to get water samples to ensure that the water is free from bacteria such as E. coli and coliform. As you saw in the video earlier, unfortunately, one of those bacteria is the source of feces. These are the 2 most common bacteria that are found in drinking water, leading to drink. One of the biggest issues with this pandemic is the uncertainty, which we have seen simply by the proactive actions of our clients. We have numerous clients that have already complied with the codes by cleaning their tanks earlier this year. Despite this, many clients have already chosen to schedule a second round of tank cleanings, knowing their building's water has been sitting stagnant all these months. Not only are clients getting their tanks cleaned multiple times a year, but many have chosen to increase the frequency of water samples that they're taking to ensure they're delivering a clean and safe water supply to the building tenants. If you've serviced your tank and it's been cleaned and disinfected, but you still come up with positive water samples, a building-wide hypochlorination would be in order. And this is basically chlorinating the entire building system in accordance with ANSI standards, which gives you 2 options: a 24-hour stagnation period at a low chlorine level, or much more aggressive at a very short period of time for a much more concentrated level of chlorine. This is something that should be considered if you're having a problem and you keep getting positive water samples after you've serviced the tank in the building. As I mentioned earlier, especially with the apartment buildings, with all of the increased sediment that's coming into the building these days, keep an eye on some pieces of equipment with all the moving parts, pumps, backflow preventers, anything with mechanical seals and O-rings. The wear and tear, also the second largest source of Legionnaires disease. It's the law to clean and disinfect your cooling tower twice a year. You want to make sure that it's in good shape, and you want to make sure it's free from the Legionella bacteria. Moving forwards, although the safety of our employees and clients has always been of the utmost importance, this has never been more appropriate than in these changing times. This is why we've taken additional measures, such as helping our mechanics avoid public transportation by having them use company vehicles to get back and forth and carpooling with other mechanics. Other mechanics have cars that they use to get back and forth to the job sites. Also, we're now sending most mechanics directly to job sites, so they don't interact with other crews in the office, and they don't interact with our office staff as well. Just another way of trying to keep safe. In addition to minimizing exposure, usage of PPE, such as disposable masks and gloves and protective suits, as well as the daily disinfecting of our equipment, has become an essential part of our daily operation. Not only does this help to protect our employees, but it helps to protect also our clients and the buildings that we service. The importance of PPE donations, as we all know, to help our local communities has never been more important, especially with all of American Pipe and Tank recently pitched in to a lot of our local hospitals and clients that were in need of this life-saving equipment. Throughout this whole conversation boils down to clean water. If you want to make sure, your tank is so clean that you could drink right from it. Now, with that said, I thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us this morning, and I hope you found this helpful. Let's open up for a Q&A. If you type your questions into the chat, I'll do my best to get to all of them. Thank you. Okay. Question from Donnie. Is there any requirement by the city to have multiple cleanings done within the year, given the COVID-19 dilemma? Donnie, good question. There is nothing that the city has sent down yet as far as any requirements for doing the tank multiple times a year. The main reason and the main purpose of this is to make sure that your buildings are not sitting with stagnant water. Question from Joel. I work with a big office building that's been I work in a big office building that's been mostly empty since March. What about the water in the tank there? And office buildings generally cleaning the tanks, excuse me. Well, as I mentioned earlier, any buildings that have been shut down for a while, the water has turned stagnant. The city normally delivers chlorine in the building, in the city water supply. Without that constantly being reintroduced into the city, the water turns stagnant and you have problems. It will become unsafe to drink. Question from Don. I understand that the cooling tower is routinely. Is there a mandate for the open loop system, plate and frame, to be serviced? Don, I wish I had the answer to your question, and I knew you'd come up with a difficult one today. I will get that answer and get back to you. But cooling towers in general, open towers, you want to make sure they're maintained to the T. Local Law 77 tells you to clean and disinfect. So compliance with Local Law 77 with cooling towers these days, that's the mandate. Question from Robert, good question. If you let us clean your tank, you can watch us. Okay, listen, simple. The men enter the tank. They all have confined space certifications. The tank is scrubbed and cleaned for all of the sediment to be removed. Once that's done, the tank is then scrubbed and cleaned again with a chlorine solution. It's then rinsed out several times. That's the disinfection process. Question from Michael. Good one. Good question, Michael, about the sediment affecting your pumps and whatnot. I wouldn't say that you should go ahead and hire a pump company at this moment, but typically pumps, when they start going bad, the bearings, they'll start making an unusual noise that you didn't hear before. That's the time to call your pump company. Thank you, Michael. Does the water need to be shut off during the tank servicing? And if so, for how long? Tamir, the servicing of the tank and the time it's shut down really depends on the size of the tank and how dirty it is inside. Routinely, from year to year, we find tanks with very little sediment that's occurred. And at other times, we find a great deal of sediment that's built up from the last year. And a lot of this has to do with the underground water mains. When the city's doing work on the underground mains, unfortunately, dirt gets into them, that works their way into the buildings. But a typical tank cleaning, a building would be shut down no more than for approximately a half a day. Thank you, Tamir. A question from Roberta. How often does a tank need to be cleaned? Great question, Roberta. The New York City codes require that anything that's domestic water related, whether it's a wood or a steel or a concrete tank, be cleaned and disinfected a minimum of once a year. In addition to the cleaning and disinfecting, a water sample must be taken, and this is then filed with the city's health department. Thank you, Roberta. Question from Dominic. Excellent question, Dominic. Should end users run their faucets from their sinks, lavatories, etc.? Dominic, if the building is open and you're getting fresh water delivered from the city, which is chlorinated, then the answer is yes. If the building's sitting stagnant, then you're just going to continue to run that stagnant water through your fixtures. So if the building's been occupied and running, or if the system has just been cleaned and serviced, then that would be the time to run all those faucets and fixtures through both hot and cold taps. Question from Vincent in Times Square, who's the chief engineer at a 40-story commercial building. The cooling towers are running. That's a good thing. But as far as the domestic water, Vincent, the routine you implemented by flushing the system and continuing to flush the system is the way to go. A minimum of once a week. Continue bringing that chlorinated water in from the city into your building and running it through all of your faucets and fixtures. Yes, that's the way to go, Vincent. Question from David. How long does a building have to maintain documents after a cleaning? Well, excellent question, because the health department has been on an absolute rampage the last few years. And they walk into a building, commercial, residential, doesn't matter. They know you have a tank, and they want to see your records from the last 5 years. Failure to produce them starts out with violations starting at $2,000. Good question, David. Question from Donnie. If cleaning was already done earlier in the year, would we have to do it again? Or is that only management's discretion? I think we saw something like this a little earlier, and the health department requires a cleaning annually. There is nothing that's been mandated yet from the health department that requires additional cleanings of your water tank every year due to the current situation. Question from Catherine regarding filtration systems installed specifically for the roof tanks. That's a great question, Catherine, because there are really two prime locations to install a filtration system. Number one is to capture the sediment coming into the building at the water main in the basement. Number two, and even more helpful, is to capture any sediment coming out of the tank. So yes, that's a very good idea. It's actually something we've been doing for many, many years, and that is installing filtration systems on the water coming out of the tank actually enters the building's tenants, systems, and apartments. Another question, should all water filters for coffee makers and any drinking water systems be replaced in commercial buildings? Yes, absolutely, especially when the building gets up and running again. The worst thing you could do to a filter is not change it. It's actually worse to have a filter in place that's not been changed than to not even have a filter at all. Question from Chris. Will this webinar be available to view on your website or elsewhere after this presentation? The answer is yes. We will be sending out a follow-up email later next week, and it'll have more helpful information for you to keep your building safe, and you will be able to see this again. Yes, thank you. Question from Chris. Is there any regular maintenance that a building staff can do on a tank? Chris, the answer is absolutely not. Unless your staff is just draining and refilling the tank just to remove any stagnant water, that's the only thing they can do. They're not allowed to clean a tank. They're not allowed to enter the tank. This all has to be done by someone that's licensed and certified to do this. Thank you. Question from Manny. Should we run water in an unoccupied building that is presently closed? What is your recommendation as to the number of times we should run the water? As mentioned earlier, you have to do this even if the building's closed. You should do this a minimum of once a week. Bring fresh, clean, chlorinated city water through your building system, through the water tank, through the plumbing system, through the cooling towers. Get rid of the stagnant water, lower the chance of unsafe water, and lower the chance of growing algae and bacteria, which is the leading cause of Legionnaire's disease. Any other questions? Well, I want to thank you for joining us today. We had some great questions. I hope you found this information very helpful and informative. We will be sending out a follow-up email next week with more information on how to keep your building safe, clean, and healthy. And I want to say thank you very much for spending this time with me this morning, and stay safe, New York.